Karen tried to kick Big Shaq out of the neighborhood, called the cops, rallied the HOA, and weaponized every rule in the book. But just when she thought she'd won, Big Shaq pulled out the deed. Turns out the one she tried to erase owned the very ground she stood on. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal arrived at Hickory Glen Estates on a Monday morning that looked like a postcard. The lawns were freshly trimmed, hydrangeas stood proud like sentinels, and wind chimes whispered secrets only the breeze understood. It was a place designed for predictability, where the mail arrived at 3:00 p.m. sharp, where the sprinklers ran in sync, and where every smile had just the right amount of tightness behind it. Into that pristine picture stepped a man built like a monument, but moved like memory, tall, deliberate, quiet. He didn't bring noise. He brought presence, and that, for some, was far more unsettling. His arrival wasn't dramatic. There were no fleets of black cars, no paparazzi, no flashy luggage, just a single moving truck, a few cautious workers who greeted him with respect, and a worn duffel bag. He carried himself into his new home on Lanford Drive. The house, a custom modern structure with minimalist lines and tall windows, sat on a corner lot that had gone unsold for years. It stood slightly apart from the rows of colonial replicas, a quiet defiance in steel and glass. It didn't try to belong. It just stood there, like he did. Neighbors noticed him before he even stepped out of the truck. They peeked through blinds, adjusted sunglasses mid-stroll, and exchanged silent glances over garden hedges. Some recognized him immediately. Others only saw the size, the color, the difference. But none of them missed the shift in atmosphere. Shaq didn't just arrive. He unsettled the balance without saying a word. That was all it took in a place like Hickory Glen. Karen Whitmore was the first to take note. She always was. From the comfort of her tastefully decorated kitchen, she observed with an instinct sharpened by years of chairing HOA meetings, planning community events, and managing neighborhood issues with subtle precision. She had a binder thicker than a legal case file, filled with HOA bylaws, architectural guidelines, landscaping regulations, and a running list of non-compliant porch lights. Her reputation wasn't aggressive, just thorough. People described her as involved. She preferred the term invested. To Karen, Shaquille wasn't a man moving into a house. He was a disruption arriving in sneakers and silence. She watched him greet the mailman with a handshake, tip the movers with a warm smile, and spend his first afternoon unpacking without even once opening the curtains. She made a note of that. It wasn't that she was prejudiced, she'd tell herself. She simply liked to maintain harmony. And harmony in her mind came from uniformity. The first letter from the HOA arrived on Shaq's second day, a thin envelope tucked into his mailbox with mechanical neatness. It stated without warmth or familiarity that his trash bins were visible from the street and must be relocated behind the privacy gate. It ended with a cheerful closing. "Thank you for keeping Hickory Glen beautiful," the kind of letter meant to seem helpful but crafted to feel corrective. Shaq read it with the patience of someone who had been here before. He folded it gently, placed it in a kitchen drawer, and moved the bins without a word. But the letters didn't stop. A week later came another, this time about a non-compliant basketball hoop temporarily leaning against the garage wall. It wasn't installed yet. It wasn't used. It simply existed. The rule, as quoted in bold font, stated that no recreational equipment may be visible from the street until approved by the board. Shaq complied again, moving the hoop inside the garage. No complaint, no pushback, just silent compliance. Still, the whispers grew. At the morning coffee shop meetup, where retirees discussed yard maintenance, as if it were foreign policy, someone asked if he was just renting. Another said they'd seen his license plate, and it wasn't local. Someone else mentioned that celebrities don't usually live in quiet places unless they're hiding something. These weren't questions, they were warnings wrapped in curiosity. Warnings that Shaquille's presence had upset the delicate facade of uniformity Hickory Glen tried so hard to preserve. Inside his home, Shaq moved slowly. Not because he was tired, but because he'd learned over the years that presence could be misread as threat. His movements were deliberate, his voice quiet, his interactions warm but brief. He kept to himself not out of arrogance, but self-preservation. His living room had soft light, family photos, and a single leather recliner where he sat each morning to read. There were no golden trophies on display, no platinum records, No signs of the empire he'd built. Just a man trying to breathe without being watched. But he was being watched. Constantly. Karen made sure of it. She logged the cars that parked in front of his house. She noted the delivery schedules. She even adjusted her walking route to pass by his yard twice a day, always offering a strained smile that never reached her eyes. When the neighborhood committee met for their monthly update, she casually mentioned adjusting protocols for new residents. Not targeting, she assured them, just maintaining standards. Then came the letter that changed everything. It wasn't from the HOA. It didn't have a signature or a return address. Just a single sheet of thick white cardstock slipped into Shaq's mailbox, centered in perfectly spaced black typewriter font. This neighborhood has an identity. We ask that all residents respect it. Some places are built for certain kinds of people, others are not. Shaq stared at the letter for a long time. His fingers didn't shake. His face didn't twitch. He simply sat down at his dining table and laid it flat. He read it again, and then he folded it and placed it in the same drawer as the others, now neatly stacked. A pattern, a pile of words trying to erase his presence one typed sentence at a time. He didn't tell anyone. Not his manager, not his friends, not the press. Because Shaq understood something very few people did. Not all battles are meant to be fought with fists or lawyers. Some required a different kind of endurance, the kind that burns slow but steady. He responded the only way he knew how, by showing up the next day at the local community center, with a van full of new computers he donated anonymously. He returned the day after that to coach a group of underprivileged teens who'd never been to an NBA game, but knew exactly who he was. He smiled at each of them like he didn't just come from a place that told him he didn't belong. Back at home, he planted sunflowers along the edge of his driveway. The yellow blooms stretched toward the sun unapologetically, and for the first time in weeks, a little girl from 2 houses down stopped and waved at him. Her father didn't, but the wave mattered more. It always did. Karen, of course, made another call. It's not the flowers, she explained. It's the message. It's the idea of people doing things outside the community process. She didn't say what she really meant. She never did. She preferred rules to truth. The next HOA letter referenced unauthorized landscaping. Shaq responded by inviting the mail carrier to pick sunflowers anytime she liked. She did, and left with tears in her eyes. One evening, a small barbecue started in Shaq's backyard. Just him, a portable grill, and a few kids from the youth center who'd earned scholarships he had quietly helped fund. There was no music, no cars parked illegally. Just laughter, smoke, and the sound of hope crackling over open flame. It didn't last an hour before someone called in a noise complaint. Police arrived, asking questions they didn't ask at other homes with real parties and loudspeakers. Shaq answered every question calmly, respectfully. The officers left, but the message lingered like smoke in the air. You're being watched. You're being judged. But he didn't stop. He hosted another event, this time a park cleanup day, unannounced and unbranded. He picked up trash with his own hands, carried bags heavier than some of the people judging him. Karen walked by during the cleanup, heels clicking on the pavement like punctuation marks. She didn't say a word, just stared, then turned. Maybe she didn't recognize what she was seeing, or maybe she did, and that scared her more. Shaq's house remained quiet at night. No parties, no guests, just a porch light that glowed like a lighthouse in unfamiliar waters. But inside that house was a man who had spent a lifetime being both admired and feared, welcomed and pushed out, cheered and dismissed, sometimes in the same breath. And now, in the quiet of a neighborhood that had no room for his kind of dignity, he was standing again. Not loudly, not defiantly, just there, and in a place that believed presence must be earned. Shaquille O'Neal's refusal to disappear was the most powerful rebellion of all. There was something about Hickory Glen that whispered rejection louder than most places shouted it. Shaq had been in cities that spat him out. He'd lived through the blunt force of hatred, the neon glare of judgment. But here, in this pristine neighborhood with white-trimmed houses and carefully choreographed smiles, rejection was practiced like a craft. It came in the form of thank you notes with knives tucked between the lines. It came wrapped in routine, spoken in HOA bylaws, and reinforced by gates not made of iron but of presumption. Still, he tried. He sponsored a local art contest for kids at the elementary school, and anonymously paid to replace the cracked sidewalk outside the library. He sent fresh meals to a single mom 2 streets over after her husband passed away, and covered the vet bill for an older neighbor's dying spaniel. These weren't grand gestures to be seen. They were small offerings, silent affirmations that he wasn't here to take space. He was here to share it. But space in Hickory Glen was curated, not shared. Karen Whitmore, self-titled steward of the community's values, never missed a beat. She watched Shaq's every move with a scrutiny she disguised as civic duty. Her eyes scanned him like a scanner at a museum, not to admire but to detect flaws. Every time he acted with grace, she questioned motive. When he waved, she saw arrogance. When he stayed silent, she saw guilt. She didn't need a reason to distrust him. She just needed his presence to make her uncomfortable, and that in her world was enough to justify anything. And Shaq saw it. He saw it every time he passed her on his morning walks with Apollo. She'd pause her steps just long enough to appear neighborly, but never long enough to speak. If their eyes met, hers would dart away, already scanning for some imperfection in his yard, some slight variation in the angle of his mailbox that might violate Section 4B of the Community Uniformity Act. The neighborhood watched her cues. Karen didn't just run the HOA. She ran the tone. If she squinted at you in church, others followed. If she nodded at your fundraiser, you suddenly found RSVPs tripling overnight. And when she decided that Shaq didn't fit, the walls began to rise. Not made of brick but of cold indifference. One morning, Shaq opened his mailbox and pulled out a pale cream envelope, with no stamp, no name, no sender. Just folded, thick paper stock. The kind used for wedding invitations or condolence notes. Inside, a single sentence in centered black type. This neighborhood has an identity. Preserve it. There was no threat, no curse word, just cold implication. He held the note a moment longer than needed. Then, without a word, he turned, stepped inside and slid it into the drawer with the others. Each one a tiny needle, each one trying to poke holes in his presence. The drawer was getting full. That week, he decided to host a neighborhood get-to-know day, in the park just across the street. Flyers printed at his own cost. A catered food truck. A table with cupcakes bearing Hickory Glen's blue and white color scheme. No banners with his name. No speeches. Just an invitation. Community. Unbranded and open. People came. At first, slowly. A few families curious more than eager. Kids chasing each other on the grass. Drawn by balloons and music playing low from a Bluetooth speaker tucked under a folding table. He smiled at each face that walked in. Offered water bottles. Handed out free sunscreen. He asked nothing. He only gave. And then the patrol car showed up. Not one with sirens. Just a quiet cruiser, doors shutting with finality. 2 officers walked over. Hands not on weapons, but resting near them. Just close enough. Noise complaint, they said. Too many people. Some neighbors thought it might be an unauthorized event. Karen arrived moments later, her steps sharp, her tone sharper. We're just trying to maintain order. These things need to be scheduled through the HOA. There's a process. Shaq looked at her for a long time before answering. It's a picnic, Karen. But that was the problem. It wasn't a picnic. It was a presence. It was a gathering that didn't ask her permission. It was joy that didn't check with the committee. He ended the event early. Apologized to every family with a warmth that undercut the chill now hanging over the grass. The kids still laughed, still chased bubbles into the air, unaware that something sacred had been pushed aside by suspicion. Later that night, another letter appeared. This one folded tight, almost viciously, and slipped under his front door like a warning. You don't belong here. We see you. We know what you're trying to do. It won't work. There was something different in this one. The font was smaller, the language tighter, like whoever wrote it was done pretending. It wasn't even cowardly now, just bitter. Shaq sat at his dining table again, Apollo lying beside him like a silent shadow. He held the note, then placed it with the others. His hands didn't tremble, but something else had begun to stir in him. Not rage, not revenge. Something colder, something clearer, a quiet resolve. He had spent years learning how to play defense in a game that didn't forgive mistakes. But off the court, the rules were different. The game was quieter, slower, but just as calculated, and he was learning. Again, how to read the court. The next morning, Shaq called a lawyer. Not to file a complaint, not to press charges. Just a consultation. A conversation about property law, ownership clauses, and neighborhood investment strategies. His tone was professional, but his questions were surgical, precise, measured. That same week, he applied for 3 permits, one for home renovation, one for yard modification, and one for property acquisition, through a private LLC he didn't name after himself. Just a number and a signature. Karen noticed. She always did. She watched construction trucks appear outside his home one morning and called the city to verify if permits were valid. They were. She took pictures. They meant nothing. She complained. No action followed. The construction wasn't loud. It was deliberate. A side yard, redesigned. A privacy fence removed. A concrete path added from his gate to the public sidewalk, lined with solar lights. The work took days, then weeks, but to those watching, it was unsettlingly orderly, like he was building something more than a backyard, and all the while he stayed quiet. He still visited the youth center, still dropped off books at the library, still offered to fix the rusted swing set at the park, which the city approved. He didn't respond to the whispers. He didn't attend the next HOA meeting, though he was invited via email, with a subtle hint, "We'd love for you to be part of the conversation shaping our community." He didn't want to be part of the conversation. He wanted to change the tone entirely. Meanwhile, Karen grew louder in her silence. Her allies on the board began circulating emails about restructuring membership, revisiting residency standards, and ensuring long-term alignment with Hickory Glen values. The words danced just enough around legality to feel safe, but their meaning was razor clear. Shaq wasn't blind to it. He had seen this kind of orchestration before, in boardrooms, locker rooms, and neighborhoods dressed in liberal tolerance but laced with quiet exclusion. He had felt it on stages and in interviews, the performance of inclusion where the script was already written to keep you at arm's length. But now he had the playbook, and he was writing his own rules. One morning, he stood at his bay window and watched as Karen adjusted her sprinklers. Her motions were precise, almost militant. She looked up once and saw him watching. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stood there, not menacing. It was the stillness of someone who was done asking to be seen. Karen's gaze broke first. That afternoon, she received a notice from her mortgage provider. A minor update in account servicing. Nothing urgent, just a shift in the entity that now held her mortgage under a new management LLC. She read the name once. Then again. It didn't register immediately. But Shaq that evening sat down at his kitchen table, poured a glass of water, and opened a folder he hadn't touched since the day he arrived. Inside were deeds, copies, dates, signatures. One for his house, one for the property, 2 doors down, and one for a place that bore Karen Whitmore's address. He wasn't planning to evict. He wasn't planning to humiliate. He wasn't planning anything. Not yet. But now, for the first time since stepping foot in Hickory Glen, Shaq didn't just live there. He owned it. The first Saturday of May rolled in with the kind of breeze that carried summer's early promise. Trees rustled like they were whispering secrets. He didn't send invitations, didn't blast announcements on social media. It wasn't meant to be a spectacle. It was just a barbecue, a grill, some folding tables, a cooler of drinks, and a playlist humming soft soul music from the 90s. Shaq had always believed food could do what words couldn't, bring people together without asking too much. So he called up the boys from the community center, invited the staff and a few kids' parents who'd thanked him privately for everything he did in silence. By noon, the smell of smoked ribs and baked beans curled through the neighborhood like incense, pulling people out of their houses with a mix of curiosity and cautious interest. The first to show up were the Jacksons. Mid-40s, new to the block, still unsure which way the social winds blew in Hickory Glen. Their 2 sons raced toward the backyard, as Shaq greeted them with open arms and paper plates. Then came Miss Lena from 2 streets over, cane in hand and wearing a sun hat, the size of a tire. She didn't speak much, but she gave Shaq a long, knowing nod that said more than words could. Some of the youth center staff brought their families. A local jazz guitarist sat up in the corner and strummed easy chords without any introduction. Laughter started to replace tension. The air felt light, but even light can cast long shadows. From her kitchen window, Karen Whitmore watched the gathering take shape like it was a storm rolling in. She counted bodies, noted license plates, took mental snapshots of folding chairs and foot traffic. She didn't say anything to her husband. He rarely got involved in these things, but her hand gripped the stem of her wine glass tighter with each new guest that crossed Shaq's lawn. She hadn't approved this. There was no form submitted to the HOA, no notice of temporary event, no schedule given for when the gathering would end. It was a breach, not of law maybe, but of control, and control, to Karen, was the scaffolding that kept civilization upright. An hour into the cookout, the backyard was full. Laughter spilled over fences, kids dashed between trees with squirt guns, and Shaq stood behind the grill like a mountain wrapped in an apron, flipping ribs with the precision of a surgeon and the joy of a man who hadn't cooked for others in far too long. Someone turned the music up a notch, just enough to be heard, but not enough to cause trouble. He wasn't foolish. He knew the rules. He just thought for one afternoon maybe they didn't have to wrap around his throat. That's when the first neighbor called the police.
It wasn't Karen.
Not directly. That would have made her the villain outright. Instead, it was one of her quieter disciples, Mr. Darrell from Elm Drive, who made the call with the even tone of concern masking condescension. "I just think the crowd's getting a little large," he said. "Not sure they have a permit for something like that. Just seems out of the ordinary." The patrol car rolled in like a punctuation mark. Blue lights flashing in full daylight. The music cut off instantly. Conversations dipped. Kids froze mid-run. The mood, once light as smoke, turned thick and watchful. 2 officers stepped out. Not aggressive, not friendly, just blank. Professional. The kind of blankness that could swing either way depending on who you were. Shaq didn't panic. He wiped his hands, took off his apron, and walked calmly to the edge of his yard to meet them. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one a reminder that presence can be power if you carry it right. The taller officer spoke first, scanning the crowd behind Shaq with the kind of practiced neutrality that only years of suspicion could teach. "We got a noise complaint," he said. Shaq nodded. "Music's off." "Number of people here?" the second officer asked, glancing at the driveway like counting heads was part of standard procedure. 32, Shaq answered calmly. "All invited. All peaceful." A pause. The officers exchanged looks. Karen stood on her lawn now, arms crossed, watching with feigned concern. She didn't move closer, didn't engage, but her presence was loud enough to rattle windows. The officers didn't ask anyone to leave. There were no citations, no warnings. They walked the perimeter once, nodded, and left, but the damage had been done. The laughter didn't come back the same. Conversations dipped into whispers. Guests began checking their phones, gathering their kids, saying quiet goodbyes. The mood had fractured. Joy, once vibrant, was now cautious. Shaq didn't stop anyone from leaving. He thanked each person, offered leftovers, made sure every kid got a bag of snacks. He smiled still, but it was a smile carved with weight, stretched thin over disappointment. By sundown, the backyard was nearly empty. Only a few plates remained on the table. A gentle breeze moved paper napkins across the grass like tumbleweeds. Apollo lay near the porch, sensing the shift, ears flicking every time a leaf crunched underfoot. Shaq sat down slowly at the edge of the steps. He watched the sun dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across his property. The sky, once wide and open, now felt like a lid. He thought about the kids who had run across his lawn like they belonged there. About the laughter that rang out before the lights showed up. About the way everyone paused, not because anything was wrong, but because they'd been taught to be afraid of how easily something could become wrong when they looked like him. This wasn't about noise. It wasn't about permits. It was about presence. He knew it. They all did, and so did Karen. Later that night, a new letter appeared in his mailbox. Same thick cream paper. No name. This one was more direct. "You're not fooling anyone. Your money doesn't change who you are. You will never belong here. You can't buy your way into something built for people like us." He didn't flinch. He didn't fold the letter. He didn't even place it with the others. He just stared at it under the kitchen light, the words glowing slightly on the polished counter. This one hit different, not harder, not more cruel, but more exposed. Whoever wrote it had given up on subtlety. It wasn't about veiled suggestions anymore. It was about rejection. Sharp, certain, unapologetic. But here's what they didn't understand. Shaq had been told no his whole life. He'd been told he was too big, too loud, too black, too much. He'd been told to tone it down, to soften his voice, to make himself smaller. And each time he'd stood a little taller, not in defiance, but in truth, because truth didn't shrink. He looked out at his yard, the chairs still arranged in half moons, the grill still warm. The barbecue hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't failed. It had revealed something cracked the mask the neighborhood wore so carefully. It showed him who was watching, who was listening, and who was waiting for him to fall out of step. And he wasn't planning to. The next morning, he woke early, cleaned up every plate, folded every chair. Then he walked to the community park, clipboard in hand, and filed a formal request to install permanent public grills near the playground. Accessible to all, free of charge. When the city asked who was funding it, he simply said, an interested neighbor. He made no speeches, posted no photos, but everyone would know. And Karen? She watched again, standing near her mailbox with her dog on a leash that barely moved. She didn't speak, but Shaq didn't need her to. He saw it in her eyes. She knew she hadn't stopped him. She'd only made him start taking notes. Shaq held the last anonymous letter in his hand, the one that said plainly what the others had danced around. It wasn't just an insult. It was a confirmation that no matter how quiet he stayed, no matter how generous or respectful or patient, someone here, maybe several, had already decided he didn't belong. He could feel it in the way their eyes lingered too long, in the way conversation stopped when he entered a room, in the silence that followed every time he extended a hand and it wasn't met halfway. They didn't see his heart. They didn't even see his history. They only saw his height, his skin, and the threat they projected onto both. And so, as he had done many times before, Shaq turned inward. He let his mind go backward, let memory crawl out from behind the polished wood panels of his present life, and reach toward places he rarely let himself revisit. He was 8 years old again, sitting on the steps of a Newark apartment, clutching a paper bag with his lunch inside. His mother, Lucille, stood across from a landlord, who smiled too much but said too little. Shaq didn't understand everything at the time, just that the man in the tie said the apartment was suddenly no longer available, even though it had been listed and they had the deposit ready. That night, Lucille cried in the kitchen, head resting against the refrigerator as if the cold metal could pull the ache out of her. She whispered the words that would stay with him for life. They don't have to say it, baby. You'll know it when you see it. Later, he'd learn what the landlord had really said on the phone to a friend. Too risky, too many kids, not our kind. He remembered standing in a grocery store after signing his first MBA deal, wearing a suit that cost more than the monthly rent of that old apartment, and feeling the security guard's eyes on his back with every aisle he passed. He had millions in the bank, endorsements stacking up, and yet he still got followed through the frozen foods section like a common thief. No confrontation, just shadows, just suspicion. And then there was the day he was drafted, surrounded by camera flashes, microphones shoved in his face, executives praising his athleticism, like it was the only trait they could acknowledge. His father, Phil, had pulled him aside that evening, away from the crowd, away from the noise, and put a firm hand on his shoulder. He didn't smile. He didn't offer congratulations. You'll be rich, son, he said, but don't expect them to treat you right, because of it. Shaq didn't understand at the time. Not fully. He was 19, high on adrenaline, staring down a life he never thought he'd have. The warning felt too heavy for the moment, but now, decades later, in the silence of a house he owned outright in a neighborhood that still whispered behind his back, it rang clearer than ever. He stood and moved toward a cabinet tucked in the far wall of the hallway. Inside was a weathered shoebox, taped once at the corner where the lid had cracked. He hadn't opened it in years. It wasn't for display, not even for himself. It was a box of things that reminded him why he kept choosing grace over retaliation. Inside were old Polaroids, one of Lucille in her nurse scrubs, laughing in the doorway with a paper cup in hand, one of Phil holding baby Shaq in one arm and a mop in the other, wearing a janitor's uniform. There were letters from kids he'd mentored, hand-drawn thank you cards, and newspaper clippings from cities he'd helped rebuild after hurricanes, all signed with quiet gratitude. He pulled out one letter, its edges browned, the handwriting shaky. It was from a boy named Terrell, from South Baton Rouge. Terrell had written about growing up in a neighborhood where the schools were forgotten, and the courts had no nets, where the only thing taller than the fences were the odds. He wrote that watching Shaq smile on national television, watching him donate to communities that looked like theirs, gave him hope, not to be a basketball star, but to be something that mattered. You don't know me, the letter ended. But because of you, I believe someone like me can have a future too. Shaq read that line again. Then again, not because he forgot, but because he needed the reminder. Not of who he was, but of why he was who he was. He wasn't staying in Hickory Glen because he needed to. He didn't need the validation of gated approval or HOA nods. He wasn't trying to prove he belonged through manicured grass and friendly waves. He stayed because his presence mattered, not to Karen, not to the HOA, but to the kid biking by the park who saw someone like him and understood that this place didn't just belong to one kind of person. Presence to Shaq wasn't about status. It was resistance wrapped in quiet purpose. It was dignity in the face of dismissal. And that's what they didn't understand. They thought if they made him uncomfortable enough, he'd leave. If they reminded him often enough that he didn't fit their image, he'd retreat to safer, wealthier, more appropriate communities. But Shaq had grown up in rejection. He'd built his peace inside of it, and now he wasn't just wealthy. He was seasoned. He knew how to let racism reveal itself while never stooping low enough to make it comfortable. He walked out to the porch, early morning dew just starting to lift from the grass. The neighborhood was still asleep. Cars silent, lights off. The world paused, and in that stillness, he made a decision. He wasn't going to shrink. He wasn't going to wait for their welcome. He wasn't going to keep filing their letters in a drawer like they were lessons he had to learn. He was going to own the space, not just the square footage, not just the deed. He was going to own it with presence, with patience, with the kind of unapologetic identity that unsettled people who'd built their power on exclusion. That afternoon, he submitted paperwork for a charitable trust in the county, focused on equity in housing access and educational resources. He named it after his mother, the Lucille Project. Its base of operation would be Hickory Glen, whether they liked it or not. He scheduled weekly basketball clinics in the neighborhood park. Open to all, sponsored privately, no need for HOA approval. It wasn't a protest. It was a blueprint. And quietly, he had his lawyer begin the process of reviewing property listings around the neighborhood perimeter. He didn't want to buy the block, just enough to remind the board that ownership had layers they hadn't considered. Later that evening, he visited Lucille's grave. He didn't do it often, not because he didn't care, but because his conversations with her didn't need gravesites. Still, today felt different. He brought her favorite flowers, sunflower yellow carnations, and sat on the stone bench nearby. "I remember what you said, Ma," he whispered. "I remember what they called us. I remember sleeping on floors and pretending it didn't hurt. And I remember you telling me not to let the world decide who I get to be." He smiled, a quiet curl at the corner of his mouth. "They're trying, Ma. They're really trying. But they forgot I come from you." As the sun dipped behind the trees, and dusk painted the sky in soft strokes of purple and gold, Shaq stood and looked back once more, not with sadness, not with rage, just a quiet nod, the kind you give when you know the fight isn't over, but you've already decided you're not leaving the ring. And when he got back home, Apollo wagged his tail in greeting. The porch light flicked on automatically, casting a soft halo around the steps. Another letter waited in the mailbox. He didn't open it. He simply took it inside, set it on the counter, and went on with his night. Some echoes deserved silence in return. It started as a whisper, like most things in Hickory Glen, a murmur between coffee sips at the corner cafe, a casual mention during a wine walk. At first it was subtle. "I wonder what the terms of Shaquille's move-in were, or celebrities don't usually buy homes in neighborhoods like this, do they?" But as weeks passed and his presence remained steady, unshaken, the tone of the questions changed. Curiosity morphed into implication, doubt into rumor, rumor into strategic slander. Karen Whitmore was a master of subtext. She didn't throw matches, she left trails of gasoline and waited for someone else to strike. She never directly accused Shaq of anything, but she didn't have to. All she needed was the right audience and the right timing. With her carefully constructed facial expressions, raised brows, half laughs, curious glances, she planted seeds in every conversation. "I mean, I just assumed he was leasing, didn't you? Or I haven't seen his name on the public property registries. Strange, right?" Those statements weren't questions, they were cues. It wasn't just idle gossip. It was a tactic. Because in a place like Hickory Glen, ownership meant more than property. It meant access, influence, and credibility. Owning your home meant you had bought into the culture, not just financially, but ideologically. Renting to Karen and her loyal circle meant something else, something temporary, something unrooted, something unearned. The real sting in the Whisper campaign wasn't just the suggestion that Shaq might be a renter. It was what followed. Maybe that's why he doesn't seem interested in participating in HOA decisions, Or if he's not invested, can we really count on him to uphold community standards? These weren't doubts about paperwork. These were doubts about belonging. And then came the meeting. Once a month, the HOA held a public forum in the clubhouse off Garden View Lane. A vaulted ceiling room with glass walls and white folding chairs. It looked more like a conference center than a community space. Residents came for snacks and social positioning. It was less about neighborhood issues and more about who could control the narrative that month. And Karen? She always controlled the narrative. Shaq had never attended one of these meetings. Not out of disregard, but out of principle. He knew when he was being baited. But this time his name was on the agenda. In small print, under new business. He didn't need a tip-off to know something was coming. The energy had been building for weeks. The timing felt too precise. And so when he walked in, tall and quiet, wearing a dark navy button-down and calm resolve on his face, every head in the room turned. Karen stood at the front, index cards in hand, her smile polished with just the right hint of concern. She didn't start with him. She started with potholes, security camera updates, the summer block party budget. But all of it felt like preamble. The room wasn't really listening. Everyone was waiting for the turn. It came halfway through. There's been discussion, Karen said carefully, regarding ownership transparency and long-term residency intentions within the neighborhood. As we all know, maintaining the integrity of our community means ensuring that those who live here are truly invested in our shared values. She never said his name. She didn't need to. The silence in the room was its own kind of tension. Some people looked at their phones. Others glanced at Shaq. A few stared straight ahead like they were pretending to be elsewhere. No one interrupted. Karen continued. Her voice dipped in faux kindness. There's no shame in leasing. Of course, but when decisions are made that affect our future, especially by residents who may not be staying long-term, I think we deserve clarity.
There it was.
Shaq didn't stand. He didn't clear his throat or raise his voice. He just sat, one leg crossed over the other, gaze steady, letting the accusation breathe. He knew the trap. If he reacted, it would validate their suspicion. If he stayed silent, they'd mistake it for weakness. But he wasn't silent out of submission. He was silent because he had already decided how the truth would speak for him. That night, back in his home, he moved to the safe in his office. A heavy black box bolted into concrete, beneath the custom shelving unit that held his father's medals and a few dusty trophies he no longer displayed. He turned the dial slowly, his fingers moving with practiced ease, and pulled out a leather folder, the edges slightly worn from age and use. Inside was the deed to his home, signed, notarized, and recorded with the county. The ink hadn't even faded yet. He flipped to the next page, a second deed, for the small 2-bedroom rental unit, on the edge of Hickory Glen. And behind that, a third document, property title number 18, the house on Birch Court. Karen's house. He looked at the page for a long moment. He hadn't bought it to spite her. He'd bought it because he could. Because when her old landlord quietly listed the property for sale through an investment trust, he saw an opportunity, not to punish, but to protect his peace, to remind her that while she played neighborhood politics, he was playing something larger, a strategy she couldn't even see the board for. Ownership didn't need applause. It just needed presence. But the time to let the documents sit quietly was coming to an end. The next day, Karen's voice was louder than ever. She'd left the HOA meeting, glowing with self-satisfaction. She spoke about it in the coffee shop, dropped hints at the dog park, made passing comments at the nail salon. He didn't deny it, did he? She'd say, as if silence were proof. And people listened, not because they believed her, but because it was easier than confronting the bias underneath. By midweek, the rumor had evolved. Some were saying Shaq's lease was short-term. Others claimed he was moving out at the end of the summer. One bold neighbor even suggested he was never the actual tenant, just staying with someone else under a quiet arrangement. It was wild speculation, but Hickory Glen didn't need truth. It needed comfort, and it found comfort in reducing him to uncertainty. Shaq noticed fewer waves in the mornings. Conversations ended more quickly. The whispers had grown legs, but he wasn't fazed. He spent the next few days in motion, meeting with his lawyer to finalize paperwork, quietly updating the records on the management company tied to Karen's property, coordinating with his team to prepare documents that would speak when he was ready to let them. He also sent a message to the HOA board, not through email, but through an invitation. He asked to sponsor a community forum about property education, home equity, and first-time buyer strategies for underrepresented families. The request was formal, the tone was generous, but the intent was clear: he wasn't going anywhere. In fact, he was just getting started. The board didn't know how to respond. Karen lobbied hard to postpone the event, claimed it wasn't within the scope of community events. But her resistance only highlighted the contradiction. How could someone so worried about investment block an event meant to teach exactly that? Then came the letter from the management firm handling her mortgage. Routine, procedural, nothing urgent, just an ownership update. Her house, now officially, was under the portfolio of GLE Holdings. It took her 2 days to realize what GLE stood for. Shaquille's full initials. Her face when it landed was colorless. She didn't call him, didn't confront him. She couldn't, not because of shame, but because her power was rooted in assumption. An assumption had just been quietly shattered. That weekend, Shaq hosted a small gathering in his front yard. Not a party, just a table with lemonade, a few chairs, and a sign that read, "Let's talk about where we live." He didn't speak for long, just thanked the ones who came, introduced a housing equity advisor, and really listened. And others did too, the ones who'd watched from the sidelines, but never liked how the game was being played. By Monday, the energy in Hickory Glen had changed. And Karen, she stayed inside most of the week, her blinds drawn, her voice silent for once. Because while she had tried to expose him, he had exposed the foundation she stood on. Karen hadn't spoken to him since the revelation at the HOA meeting, and that suited Shaq just fine. Because silence, as he'd learned, wasn't a void, it was a space where truths echoed louder. The rumors had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. Karen had gone quieter since the mortgage notice arrived. She still walked Bentley past his house, her posture straight as steel, her face unreadable, but her pace had changed. Less confident, less certain. She didn't glance at him anymore. She didn't smirk. She didn't try. It wasn't surrender, not yet. But it was a flicker, a moment where the queen realized the board wasn't hers after all. And Shaq, he was still moving pieces. 3 months earlier, he'd made his first discreet purchase, a modest property 3 doors down, originally listed by a retiring couple eager to move closer to their grandkids. No signs, no bidding war, just a quiet offer from a limited liability company that looked like any other faceless investor group. The couple took the deal, thankful for the smooth process. They never knew who the buyer was. That was the point. 2 weeks later, a second property came up, this one smaller, a bit weathered, tucked behind Karen's. The owner was underwater, on a second mortgage, looking to offload before foreclosure caught up. Shaq's team acted fast, using the same LLC GLE Holdings. Same pattern, same anonymity. It slid through the cracks unnoticed, like a leaf drifting between fence slats. Quiet, clean, legal. And now, without ever announcing a thing, Shaq owned 3 homes in Hickory Glen. One of them belonged to the neighborhood's loudest gatekeeper. Karen had no idea. Not yet. She still believed she was playing the long game, holding her breath until he got tired of the microaggressions and left on his own. She thought the pressure had worked. She believed his silence at the last meeting was a retreat, that the lack of rebuttal was an admission of weakness. But Shaq wasn't retreating. He was preparing. Because he hadn't just bought property. He had gathered a paper trail. It started with surveillance footage from the community park, not of the barbecue, but of the moments afterward. He'd installed the cameras quietly, with city approval, long before the event, citing safety concerns after a string of minor vandalism incidents. No one objected. In fact, Karen had praised the initiative in an earlier meeting. That footage showed the police arriving. It showed the neighbors watching. It showed Karen standing near the hedge with her phone out, tapping something just moments before the cruiser turned the corner. He didn't need to hear the call to know who made it happen. He just needed the timestamp. His attorney could handle the rest. Then there were the letters, all 7 of them. Carefully preserved, fingerprinted, documented. 3 had no prints at all, 4 had partials, and 1, tucked behind the others in his drawer, had a faint impression, a partial loop pattern, consistent with a nail salon-grade manicure. A forensic analyst identified it as a 92% match to prints publicly visible on Karen's real estate license record, which was part of the state's open file for professional credentialing. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He didn't want her to backpedal. He wanted her to keep digging herself deeper into a corner. Because Shaq wasn't after embarrassment. He was after exposure, and exposure required timing. So while Karen strutted through HOA business like nothing had changed, Shaq began orchestrating something bigger, something that would make a single meeting feel like a warm-up. It began with a letter, this time sent by certified mail to the HOA board. It came from a law office out of Atlanta, crisp and professional. The letter outlined a concern regarding the discriminatory application of community regulations and the selective enforcement of bylaws against residents of color. It cited specific incidents. It named policies. It didn't accuse individuals. Not yet. But it asked for a full audit of past violations issued in the last 5 years, along with documentation of all community complaints. The board panicked. Not because they knew who sent it, but because they didn't. And when Karen tried to steer the conversation away from it at the next meeting, insisting it was just standard pushback from change-resistant residents, the treasurer, a woman named Delilah, who had once voted with Karen on nearly every matter, raised her hand. "I think we need to take this seriously," she said. "It's not just about us anymore." Karen froze. She could feel the shift. For the first time, someone wasn't taking her word as gospel. Meanwhile, Shaq stayed out of sight. He let his team work behind the curtain. Every call, every document, every ownership paper was ready to be revealed. But not until the moment could no longer be ignored. Because it wasn't about catching her off guard. It was about making sure everyone saw what had been hidden in plain sight. The paper trail wasn't just legal. It was personal. Emails from a neighborhood Google group surfaced. Old threads where Shaq's name had been referenced indirectly. Words like unconventional presence, cultural mismatch, and temporary figure appeared. All phrases vague enough to deflect legal heat, but sharp enough to carve intention. A former HOA member, now living in a nearby town, forwarded the emails to Shaq's team, said she always felt uncomfortable with the tone, but hadn't known how to speak up. She had watched from afar as Karen continued to shape the narrative, and decided it was time someone else did too. Shaq sent her a thank you note. No logo, no signature, just "I appreciate your courage. Truth doesn't ask for volume, just honesty." The final piece came 2 weeks later, when the title company updated the public records database. All 3 properties now showed GLE Holdings as the managing entity. All legal. All official. All searchable. Anyone could look it up. Which meant the truth was no longer a weapon in Shaq's hands. It was just a fact, sitting in the open, waiting for acknowledgement. And Karen? She found out on a Tuesday. It was supposed to be a simple refinance, a way to adjust the terms of her mortgage and free up cash for renovations. Her banker walked her through the online portal. She typed in her address, and then she saw it. Current Property Management, GLE Holdings. She didn't believe it at first. Thought it was a clerical error. Called the office. Demanded clarification. And when they confirmed it, when they read the mailing address tied to the LLC's attorney of record, an Atlanta firm she vaguely remembered from a neighborhood letter, her voice caught. She hung up without another word. Her silence, this time, wasn't strategic. It was stunned, because the man she had tried to discredit, the neighbor she had whispered about, the presence she had tried to erase, had been 2 steps ahead of her the entire time. And now, he held not just the moral high ground, but the paperwork to back it up. Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't throw a party, or post online. He just walked Apollo that evening like always. Past her house, past the corner where she once stood tall, past the park bench where the neighborhood kids now played freely. He nodded at the new couple moving in down the street. A young black family he'd personally encouraged to apply for a loan through his housing equity trust. They waved back. He stopped for a moment across from Karen's driveway. She was inside. The lights were on, but the curtain didn't move. And for the first time since arriving in Hickory Glen, Shaq smiled. Not in defiance, not in triumph, but in calm. Because he wasn't just part of the neighborhood anymore. He was the neighborhood. And the paper trail proved it. Karen Whitmore had called the meeting under the guise of process. Officially, it was an emergency HOA session, prompted by what she called a growing concern about long-term community stability. But everyone knew what it really was. A veiled move to push Shaquille O'Neal out, or at least strip him of any moral footing he still held. She had dressed it up with phrases like residency review and preservation of neighborhood character. But the undertones weren't even subtle anymore. This was her counterplay, her attempt to reclaim the board, to restore her power. Flyers had gone out under the pretense of transparency. There would be an open forum, followed by a private board review. But word spread faster than any flyer. Neighbors texted one another, forwarded invites, whispered at doorsteps. Everyone knew this meeting wasn't about bylaws. It was about Shaq, about his presence, his patience, his silence, and whether it would be enough to withstand the final push. By noon, the community clubhouse was full. Folding chairs lined the open floor, arranged in neat rows facing the long rectangular table at the front, where Karen stood flanked by 3 other board members. Her hair was perfect, her lipstick deliberate, her expression polished into professional concern. She wore a soft blue blazer, the kind meant to signal calm control and confidence. Shaq arrived quietly, dressed in black slacks and a gray quarter-zip pullover, his presence as composed as ever. He didn't bring anyone with him. No entourage, no legal team, just a man carrying a leather folder under one arm and the weight of weeks' worth of slights on his shoulders. He nodded at a few familiar faces, not smiles, just small acknowledgments. The kind that said, "I see you, still here." Karen opened the meeting with rehearsed warmth. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to join us on such short notice. We're here today to talk about something that affects us all, the integrity and future of Hickory Glen." She scanned the crowd, made sure the cameras were rolling. Local media had been tipped off by someone, though Karen denied any involvement, and then continued. "In recent months," she said, "there have been questions raised by several residents. Not accusations, just questions. About whether the standards we've upheld as a community are still being applied fairly and consistently. We're not here to judge anyone. We're here to clarify, to align, and to protect what we've built together." Her tone was soft, but her words were sharp. She went on for several minutes, citing irrelevant statutes, vague complaints, and selectively chosen examples of unusual property transitions and lack of clarity around lease arrangements. She never said his name, not once, but every word pointed to him like arrows laced in sugar, and Shaq just listened. When she finished, she looked across the room and paused for effect. "Before we move to a preliminary vote, we'd like to open the floor to any residents who'd like to speak." There was silence. Then Shaq stood. Not hurried, not dramatic, just quiet, steady, unshaken. He walked to the front of the room, the leather folder still under his arm. Karen offered a tight smile, trying to maintain her composure. She didn't know what he would say, but she assumed it would be defensive, maybe even emotional. She was ready for that. She had rehearsed her response. But Shaq didn't speak. He laid the folder gently on the table, clicked it open, and pulled out 3 sheets of paper. Without a word, he placed them side by side. The first was the deed to his house. Name, date, full purchase price. Paid in full. No mortgage. The second was a property management agreement, one showing a long-term lease to the Johnsons, the family living 3 doors down, under a trust named GLE Holdings. The third was a copy of the title for 318 Birch Court, Karen's address. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He simply turned the papers toward the board and stepped back. The room held its breath. Karen leaned forward slowly, her eyes locking on the title page. Her smile froze. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. The seal was there, the signature, the transfer date.
Her house, under his company.
For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time folded inward. Every neighbor, every board member, every skeptic who had doubted his place in this community, they all sat in stunned silence, watching a narrative crumble. Shaq didn't need to say, "I own your house." He didn't need to say anything, because the silence did all the speaking. It was louder than any defense. It was heavier than any accusation. It was final. Karen tried to recover. She shuffled papers, adjusted her blazer, cleared her throat. This is highly unorthodox. This is..." Shaq raised a hand gently, not to interrupt, but to finish it. "I've never missed a payment, never violated a bylaw, never disrespected a single neighbor here," he said, voice low, steady. "But since the day I arrived, I've been monitored, whispered about, and misjudged." He turned to the room. "I didn't buy these properties to make a point. I bought them because I believe communities should reflect truth, not just tradition. I've watched this place run on fear disguised as policy, on exclusion packaged as process, and I'm not here to fight anyone. I'm here to stay." He didn't raise his tone. He didn't look angry, but every word landed like stone. He picked up the papers and returned them to the folder.
"I don't need your vote. I already live here, and so do the people you tried to push out.
Then he walked back to his seat. The room stayed silent. Some people looked at Karen. Others looked away entirely. Delilah, the board treasurer, leaned into her mic. "I motion to suspend the vote," she said, her voice quiet, but resolute. "Indefinitely." Another board member nodded. "Seconded." Karen sat frozen. She had built her power on appearances, on suggestion, on perception. But now, the perception was shattered. She wasn't the authority anymore. She was a tenant. The cameras were still rolling, but no one had the heart to spin it. Later, people would say it was the quietest exit they'd ever seen from an HOA meeting. No shouting, no applause, just truth laid bare, and a room full of people who suddenly realized the rules were being rewritten. Not in defiance, but in dignity. Shaq didn't stay for the after-meeting chatter. He walked out, Apollo waiting patiently by his SUV, tail wagging. He drove home slow, windows down, air cool against his skin. He had never wanted to embarrass anyone. He had only wanted to be left in peace. But when peace is denied long enough, it returns in the form of clarity. And on this Sunday it had arrived not with noise, but with precision. He didn't win a war. He didn't need to. He simply reminded them who really lived here. Everyone had seen what happened. The silence Shaq dropped on the table that day spoke louder than anything Karen had ever orchestrated. And though the board had suspended the vote and the cameras had gone home, the real story was still echoing behind every door. It wasn't just that Shaq owned property. It wasn't even that he owned hers. It was that he did so without raising his voice, without flinching, without reaching for the same tactics used against him. That unsettled them more than if he had exploded. People waited. At first cautiously. They expected revenge. They whispered about what was next. Would Karen be evicted? Would Shaq put a sign in her yard? Would he raise her rent to make a point? Would he press charges for harassment or retaliation? Instead, for a full week, he did nothing. He didn't change his walking route. He still passed her house every morning with Apollo, as if the balance of power hadn't shifted beneath their feet. He didn't look up at her windows, didn't pause, just moved forward, the way he always had. But that simplicity now held weight, and Karen, once the neighborhood's anchor of authority, began to unravel beneath its silence. The letter came quietly. She found it in her mailbox one Thursday morning, folded inside a plain envelope, with no return address, no flourish, no logo, just a single typed page. The lease terms were unchanged, except for one revision, rent reduced to $1 per month. Effective immediately. No explanation. No note. Just a new contract. Karen stood frozen in her kitchen, letter trembling in her hand. She read it twice, a third time. Her pride wanted to shred it. Her pride wanted to call her lawyer. But her pride also knew what this meant. This wasn't charity. It was reflection. It was the most humiliating mercy she'd ever been offered. Shaq hadn't thrown her out. He'd left her in. Left her exactly where she had tried to push him out from. But now she had to sit in that house, knowing who really allowed her to remain. Knowing every step she took on that hardwood floor came with the reminder that she lived there by his grace. Not legal grace. Personal grace. He didn't need to own her. He let her live with herself. And that punishment for someone like Karen was far worse. Word spread faster than he intended. The board caught wind. Neighbors speculated. Some thought it was a stunt. Others thought it was too soft. But those who understood Shaq truly understood him. Knew it wasn't about retribution. It was about correction. He wasn't interested in humiliation. He was interested in stillness. And that stillness was felt everywhere. Delilah knocked on his door 2 days later. She held a pie, homemade, still warm, and her eyes flicked with something between shame and sincerity. She didn't stay long. Just said, "You didn't have to be that gracious," before walking away. Others left notes. Some apologized in vague terms. "We misunderstood. Thanks for being patient with us. Glad you're here." None of them mentioned Karen directly. No one wanted to say they followed her lead. No one wanted to admit they were complicit. But that was fine with Shaq. He wasn't tallying apologies. He wasn't collecting points. He was watching not for guilt, but for growth. And slowly, it came. One neighbor invited a black couple to the book club. A first. Another asked if Shaq would be willing to speak to their son's school about mentorship. A teenager from down the block started walking with him, and Apollo in the mornings. The change wasn't loud, but it was real. Hickory Glen wasn't transformed overnight, but it had been unsettled, and in that space, there was finally room for something better. Karen, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She still went on walks, though less frequently. Still attended board meetings, though no longer at the head of the table. Her power had not been taken from her. She'd been allowed to keep it, which somehow made it feel emptier. She was present, but no longer a force. Her gaze now dropped before Shaq's. Her words held hesitation where there used to be command. Shaq didn't rub it in. In fact, he barely acknowledged it. That was the final blow. Because Karen had spent years mastering power in small ways, through control, through regulation, through suggestion. She didn't know how to fight a man who refused to wrestle. She didn't know how to win against someone who never entered the arena. She thought she could push him to his limits, but she never realized his limits weren't where hers were. The story made its way beyond Hickory Glen. Though not through tabloids or clickbait, it was a quiet story, passed between colleagues in law offices, whispered in real estate circles, even admired quietly by people who once doubted him. They called it the one. It became a case study in leadership seminars, an example of how restraint could be more powerful than revenge. Shaq never spoke publicly about it. Not in interview. Not on social media. He didn't need to. His piece was his statement. Ownership, to him, had never been about titles or turf. It was about choice. The choice to stay, the choice to forgive, the choice to stand taller than the world expected. Again and again. He made no effort to reclaim narratives or correct the past. He simply built new ones. He sponsored 3 scholarships at the local high school. Anonymously, but word eventually leaked. He donated equipment to the youth center. He funded free financial literacy classes at the community hall, run every Saturday morning by a team he'd quietly assembled. He never took credit, just showed up to help set up chairs. And for those paying attention, it was clear. He wasn't just building a life in Hickory Glen. He was rebuilding the story of what it meant to live there. As fall deepened and leaves gathered in piles across sidewalks, something else gathered too. A quiet respect. Not loud, not performative, but real. The kind that grew in the places where judgment had once lived. Shaq still walked with Apollo every morning. He still waved. Now more people waved back. And when he passed Karen's house, he didn't look up. He didn't need to. She had already seen enough. Some would say he let her off easy. That he should have made a louder point. But those people didn't understand the cost of grace. They didn't understand the weight of mercy. They didn't understand what it took to stand in front of the very people who questioned your worth and offer them nothing but the proof of your character in return. Shaq understood it because he'd lived it. Because his mother taught him that forgiveness wasn't for the forgiven. It was for the free. And Shaq in Hickory Glen was finally free. Not from racism. Not from judgment. But from the need to prove anything. He had walked in as a stranger. He stayed as a mirror. And what they saw in that reflection, that was never his burden. It was theirs. The park, once empty in the early evenings, had become a meeting place. The court Shaq had helped repave through a quiet grant was now alive, laughter echoing against backboards, sneakers squeaking across the blacktop, music drifting softly from someone's portable speaker. The edge of the court had benches now. A mural was underway on the far wall, painted by teens from the youth center, a swirl of faces, colors and stories. It wasn't just a basketball court anymore. It was a pulse, a space that beat with something real. The change didn't come like thunder. It came the way seasons turn. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, until one day you look up and realize the air feels different. The light touches things more gently, and something heavy has quietly lifted. In Hickory Glen, that change began not with a speech or a protest, but with the steady sound of a basketball bouncing on fresh pavement. No one asked who had paid for it. They didn't need to. Some knew. Some guessed. But Shaq never confirmed. He didn't install a plaque, didn't take a picture, just showed up once a week, in plain clothes, to rebound for kids who were still learning how to trust their own aim. On Saturdays, a community garden took root in the narrow lot behind the old tool shed, once overgrown and forgotten. Raised beds were built from donated wood, the soil tilled by volunteers, and small green signs marked each plot: spinach, bell peppers, sage. Grandmothers came with shears in hand and left with bouquets of herbs. Children watered seeds like they were protecting treasure. The garden smelled like basil, rainwater, and second chances. None of it had been formally announced. No grand openings. Just movement. Just care. And with each passing week, Hickory Glen started to breathe again. Differently this time. More deeply. Less guarded. Karen's house was the last to speak. She was gone by the end of the week. The for sale sign appeared early one morning. No ceremony, no open house announcement. Just a clean white post in the ground, and a phone number taped inside the front window. No goodbye email, no invitations. Just absent. The listing stayed up for 3 days before the status quietly changed to under contract. Shaq didn't comment when her moving truck rolled out. He watched it from his porch, Apollo seated beside him, tail thumping against the wood like a metronome. The sun was beginning to set. The sky dipped in gold and lavender, and he just stood there quiet and still. Not triumphant, just present. Her departure didn't trigger a celebration. There were no cheers, no schadenfreude, just a collective stillness, like the exhale of a long-held breath. And maybe that was fitting, because in the end, she didn't leave because she was pushed. She left because the ground had shifted beneath her, and she couldn't find her footing anymore. The system she had built, of coded control and invisible lines, no longer held. Her influence had eroded, not by resistance, but by refusal. The neighborhood had changed, but so had he. This place, once cold, once calculating, had become something he hadn't expected. A canvas. Not clean, not perfect, but ready. And in it he'd painted something more lasting than defiance. Dignity. He had learned early in life that justice rarely came in applause. It came in small acknowledgments. A door left open. A child waving from a porch that once stared through him. A white neighbor dropping off zucchini bread with a quiet, "Thanks for staying." These were not the loud gestures, but they were real. And real was enough. It was simple. Steel frame. Clean font. Nothing ornate. The biggest sign of change wasn't the court or the garden. It came on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after Karen left. The HOA, after months of resistance, silence, and bureaucracy, finally installed a new sign at the entrance of the park. It read, there had been arguments about the wording. Some said it was too broad. Others said it was too political. But in the end, the vote was unanimous. Not because they were all convinced, but because they were all ready to stop pretending. Shaq saw the sign the morning it went up. He didn't take a picture, didn't mention it on social media. He just nodded and kept walking. You belong. They sat in silence for a while. He accepted one with a small smile. That night, Delilah from the board stopped by his house. She stood on his porch, eyes squinting into the dusk, holding 2 mugs of tea. Figured you might not want company, she said, but I brought the kind that doesn't ask for conversation. Some people still don't get it, she admitted. They think you won, that this was about control. Then she said, it's different now. He nodded, little bit. It wasn't about winning, he said. It was about not leaving. Shaq looked out at the neighborhood, at the porch lights glowing in unison, at the kids skateboarding without glances over their shoulders, at the empty house across the street. Delilah sipped her tea. You changed things. I reminded them who they already were, he replied. The ones who chose fear just needed to see someone stay long enough to hold up a mirror. She let the words hang, then stood, placed her empty mug on the porch rail, and said, glad you're here. I've been here, he said. And she walked off into the dark, just as quietly as she came. The next morning, a small boy Shaq didn't recognize, maybe 6, maybe 7, stopped him outside the park. The boy looked up, held out a crumpled paper drawing of a house with a basketball hoop in the driveway, and 2 stick figures, one big, one small, smiling beside a dog. That's you, the boy said, pointing to the larger stick figure. I drew your house, because it's the coolest one. Shaq took the drawing with both hands, heart unexpectedly heavy. Thanks, lil' man, he said. That means a lot. The boy ran off before he could ask his name. Later, he pinned the drawing to his fridge, the only thing up there besides a picture of his mom, Lucille, and a quote she once wrote on a napkin, and taped to his locker when he was 14. You don't need their spotlight. Just bring your own light. It was the house that dignity built. The house he stood in now wasn't just brick and wood. Not of a man who forced change. A place where silence had spoken louder than confrontation. Where grace had cut deeper than retaliation. Where belonging wasn't granted. It was claimed. And that was the story of Hickory Glen. Because sometimes, justice doesn't roar. But of a man who embodied it. A man who walked in peace, stayed in purpose, and showed a community how to remember its humanity. Sometimes it stands tall, and lets the silence speak. Some stories echo long after the last word. If this one made you pause, made you feel, or made you think twice, then you're exactly where you need to be. Keep watching the quiet ones. They're usually the ones rewriting the rules.